The heavy crystal wine glass shattered against my forehead with a sickening crack. Blood immediately poured into my eyes, blinding my left side, running hot and thick down my cheek to soak the collar of my favorite linen shirt. Through the sharp ringing in my ears, I heard my own son Justin defending the woman who had just thrown it. "You are being selfish," he yelled at me while I bled. "You have empty bedrooms. Look what you made her do." I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took my napkin, wiped the blood from my jaw, smiled a very quiet smile, and walked out the front door. I drove myself to the emergency room, and while a doctor was stitching my brow, I pulled out my phone and texted my estate lawyer. "Phase 1 is complete. Deploy the police. Before I tell you how a 69-year-old retired structural engineer ended up orchestrating the ultimate downfall of his own flesh and blood, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly destroy the people who mistook your silence for weakness. To understand how my family reached the point of physical violence over an Easter dinner, you have to understand the foundation we were standing on. For 40 years, I worked as a commercial structural engineer. My job was to calculate stress loads, identify weak points, and ensure that skyscrapers would not collapse under pressure. I applied that same meticulous calculation to my finances. My late wife Beatrice and I lived well below our means. We drove reliable cars, took modest vacations, and quietly built a multi-million-dollar real estate and investment portfolio that no one, not even our son Justin, fully comprehended. Beatrice was the heart of our family. She was the mortar that held the bricks together. When she passed away from a sudden illness 3 years ago, the warmth left our sprawling suburban estate, leaving me alone in a 4-bedroom house that suddenly echoed with too many memories. It was during my grieving period that I began to notice the structural flaws in my own son. Justin had married Vanessa a few years prior. At first, I thought she was just ambitious, a young woman who appreciated the finer things in life. But after Beatrice died, Vanessa's ambition mutated into a suffocating entitlement. She and Justin began treating me not as a grieving widower, but as a stubborn squatter sitting on their future inheritance. They would visit for Sunday dinners, not to comfort me, but to take inventory. Vanessa would run her fingers over Beatrice's antique vases, remarking on how well they would fit in her own living room. Justin would ask pointed questions about my living trust, thinly veiling his greed as financial concern for my old age. I played the part of the tired, oblivious old man perfectly. I nodded, I smiled, and I paid for their expensive dinners, watching the stress fractures in their character widen day by day. The pressure finally reached its breaking point on Easter Sunday. I had invited Justin and Vanessa over for a traditional holiday roast, hoping for a peaceful afternoon. I should have known better when they arrived an hour late, bringing Vanessa's parents, Gary and Patricia, along with them. I had not invited Gary and Patricia. I barely tolerated them. They were loud, deeply materialistic, and chronically irresponsible with their finances. But I am a polite man, so I welcomed them in, set 2 extra plates at my long mahogany dining table, and opened a second bottle of an expensive vintage wine that Beatrice used to love. The tension in the dining room was palpable from the moment we sat down. Gary ate my food aggressively, complaining between bites about the terrible economy, unfair banking regulations, and how the world was rigged against honest guys like him. I knew the truth. I knew Gary and Patricia had just lost their luxury condominium to foreclosure because they had remortgaged it 3 times to fund a lifestyle they could not afford. Patricia sat next to him, sipping her wine and looking around my vaulted dining room with hungry, calculating eyes. She complimented the crown molding. She admired the natural light. She kept mentioning how much space I had for just one person. I sat at the head of the table, cutting my lamb, letting them talk. As an engineer, I know that when a structure is about to fail, it always groans first. Vanessa was the one who made the building collapse. She cleared her throat, placing her cutlery down with a deliberate, theatrical slowness. Douglas, she began using my first name with that sickly, sweet tone she reserved for manipulation. Justin and I have been talking. You know, my parents are going through a totally unfair transition right now with their housing situation. I chewed my food swallowed and dabbed my mouth with a napkin. I am aware they lost their condo, yes. Vanessa bristled slightly at my bluntness, but recovered her fake smile. Right. Well, they need a place to stay to get back on their feet. And since you are rattling around in this massive estate all by yourself, it only makes sense for them to move into the East Guest Wing. She did not ask. She stated it as a finalized business plan. Patricia chimed in immediately, forcing a bright laugh. Oh, it would be wonderful, Douglas. We would be like roommates. And don't worry about clearing out Beatrice's old sewing room. We already took some measurements when we used the restroom earlier. Our king-sized bed will fit perfectly if we just move that old vanity out to the garage. They had measured my deceased wife's sanctuary while I was carving the roast. The sheer audacity of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I looked down the table at my son. Justin was staring intently at his plate, avoiding my eyes entirely. He knew about this ambush. He had orchestrated it with them. They genuinely believed that because I was old and alone, I would just fold under the collective pressure and hand over the keys to my home. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch until it became agonizing for them. Finally, I set my glass down and looked directly at Vanessa. No. The single syllable dropped onto the table like a lead weight. Vanessa blinked, her fake smile freezing on her face. Excuse me, I said. No, Vanessa. My home is not a halfway house for people who gamble away their mortgages. The guest wing remains closed. Gary slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware rattle. Now listen here, Douglas. We are family. You have more money and space than you know what to do with. You cannot just hoard it all to yourself while we struggle. I turned my gaze to Gary, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. You are not my family, Gary. You are guests in my home eating food you did not pay for, drinking wine you cannot pronounce. I suggest you lower your voice. Vanessa's face turned a mottled, furious red. The facade of the sweet daughter-in-law vanished completely, revealing the vicious, entitled core beneath. How dare you talk to my father like that? She hissed, her voice trembling with rage. You are just a bitter, selfish old man. You sit in this giant house surrounded by dead things waiting to die yourself. You have empty bedrooms. You owe us this. We are the only ones who even bother to check on you. I looked at her with absolute pity, which I knew would enrage her further. I do not owe you a single breath of my life, Vanessa. And if you think your forced Sunday visits entitle you to my property, you are vastly underestimating my intelligence. The answer is no. Now I think it is time for all of you to leave. I do not know if it was the humiliation of being rejected or the realization that her free ride was over. But Vanessa lost whatever fragile grip she had on her sanity. With a guttural scream of frustration, she grabbed her heavy crystal wine glass by the stem. She did not throw the wine. She threw the entire glass. It flew across the length of the table with terrifying speed. I barely had time to turn my head before the thick crystal struck me squarely on the left side of my forehead. The glass shattered on impact, exploding into sharp fragments that showered my shoulders and the tabletop. A blinding flash of pain ripped through my skull. I stumbled back in my chair, bringing my hand up to my face. My fingers came away slick and wet with warm blood. The cut was deep right above my eyebrow, and the blood began to cascade down my face, dripping steadily onto my white linen shirt. For 3 seconds, the dining room was completely silent. The only sound was my heavy breathing and the drip of my own blood hitting the wooden floor. I looked through my unblurred eye, expecting to see horror on my son's face. I expected to see Justin leap up, rush to my side, perhaps grab a towel or scream at his wife for assaulting his elderly father. Instead, Justin stood up, his face pale, but his anger directed entirely at me. "You are being selfish," he yelled, his voice cracking with misplaced outrage. "Why do you always have to push her buttons? You have empty bedrooms, Dad. You could have just said yes. Look what you made her do." He was defending the woman who had just split my head open. In that singular crystal-clear moment, the final load-bearing pillar of my fatherly love collapsed. The son I had raised, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man whose college tuition I had fully funded was gone. Standing in his place was a weak, greedy stranger who viewed my blood as an inconvenience to his inheritance. Patricia was gasping, pulling Vanessa back, while Gary nervously muttered that things had gone too far. But Vanessa stood there, chest heaving, glaring at me without an ounce of remorse. I did not yell. I did not curse them out. Shouting is for people who have lost control, and I was entirely in control. I picked up a clean linen napkin from the table and pressed it firmly against the gash on my forehead. I stood up slowly, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight. I looked at Justin. I looked at Vanessa. I did not say a single word. I gave them a slow, cold smile that caused the blood on my face to stretch and pull. I saw the briefest flash of genuine terror in Vanessa's eyes as she realized I was not reacting like a frightened victim. I turned my back on them, walked into the foyer, took my heavy wool coat from the rack, and walked out my own front door. I got into my car, the napkin still pressed to my bleeding head, and drove in absolute silence through the dark, quiet suburban streets toward the local emergency room. The physical pain in my head was sharp and throbbing, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. Sitting in the stark, brightly lit triage room smelling of antiseptic and iodine, I waited for the doctor to come stitch my face. I reached into my coat pocket with my free hand and pulled out my phone. I opened my messages and found the contact for Mr. Lawson, the most ruthless estate and litigation attorney in the state. I typed out a single, precise message. Phase 1 is complete. I am currently at the emergency room with a lacerated forehead. Vanessa threw a crystal glass at my face. My son defended her. Deploy the police to my estate immediately for domestic assault and prepare the emergency injunctions we discussed last month. It is time to burn it all down. I hit send. I leaned my head back against the cold hospital wall, feeling the blood slowly congealing on my cheek. Justin and Vanessa thought they had broken me. They thought they had won the house by chasing me out. They had no idea that by drawing my blood, they had just handed me the legal ammunition I needed to execute a financial and legal slaughter, so devastating it would leave them with absolutely nothing. I sat in the quiet isolation of my luxury sedan in the hospital parking lot. The stitches in my forehead pulled tight, with every heartbeat, a dull and constant throb that reminded me of the profound betrayal I had just experienced. The night air was cold against my window, isolating me from the sterile chaos of the emergency room. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the security application. Years ago, when Beatrice first became ill and her mobility began to decline, I had discreetly installed cameras in the common areas of the estate so I could monitor her safety while I worked in my home office. I never removed them. Now those small lenses hidden in the crown molding served a very different purpose. I turned up the volume on my phone and watched the live feed of my dining room in crisp, high definition. They had not left. Of course they had not left. I watched them moving through my home with the arrogant comfort of conquering invaders. Gary was sitting in my custom leather armchair, his feet propped carelessly on the antique coffee table, holding a fresh glass of my vintage wine. Patricia was walking through the hallway, pointing at the framed artwork on the walls, loudly discussing with her husband which pieces they would throw out to make room for their own cheap decorations. They were already redecorating a house they did not own. In the center of the dining room, Vanessa and Justin stood close together. Vanessa was smiling, her hands resting flat on Justin's chest, praising him for finally putting the old man in his place. Through the audio feed, I could hear her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. She told him that he was the man of the house now. She told him that it was about time someone showed me that I could not control them forever. Justin puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of himself. He truly believed I had fled the house in defeat. He believed my silence was a surrender. He believed the estate was now firmly in his grasp. They had not even bothered to clean up my blood. The dark crimson droplets were still visibly staining the expensive dining room rug. The shattered remains of the heavy crystal wine glass had merely been kicked into a lazy pile near the baseboard, so no one would step on them. They were celebrating their perceived dominance while the evidence of their crime was still drying on the floor. I watched Vanessa lift her fresh glass of wine to toast her parents. Gary raised his glass in return, letting out a loud, booming laugh that echoed through my empty halls. Then the heavy oak front door was illuminated by the distinct strobing flash of red and blue lights. 3 patrol cars had pulled into the circular driveway, completely silently, precisely as Mr. Lawson had requested when he contacted the precinct. The doorbell chimed a melodic and cheerful sound that starkly contrasted with the reality standing on my porch. On my phone screen, the celebration stopped instantly. Gary lowered his glass, his loud laugh dying in his throat. Patricia froze in the hallway, her hand still hovering over a painting. Justin looked confused, his proud posture deflating into uncertainty. He walked to the foyer, adjusting his shirt, and pulled open the heavy front door. 2 uniformed police officers stood on the porch. A third officer stood slightly behind them, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. Justin immediately put on his best face of entitled authority. He asked if there was a problem using a tone of voice reserved for customer service complaints. He told the officers that his father had suffered a little accident earlier in the evening, but assured them that everything was perfectly fine and under control. He was trying to control the narrative before the officers could even speak. The lead officer did not smile. He simply stepped past Justin into the foyer, his eyes immediately scanning the room. He asked for Vanessa by her full legal name. Vanessa stepped forward from the dining room, her fake sweet smile returning to her face. She played the victim beautifully. She told the officers that her father-in-law was very unstable and prone to erratic behavior. She claimed that I had fallen, that I had hit my head on the table, and that I had run away in a state of confusion when they tried to help me. She actually had the audacity to say they were just about to call the police to request a welfare check on me. It was a beautiful, desperate, completely fabricated lie. The officer did not flinch. He looked at Vanessa with an expression of absolute cold professionalism. He informed her that they had just received a verified medical report from the emergency room, alongside high-resolution photographs of the injury and a formal complaint filed directly by the district attorney through my legal counsel. He stated clearly that the laceration on my forehead was consistent with a high-velocity projectile impact, not a fall. Then, the officer looked past Vanessa and pointed directly at the dining room floor. He noted the blood on the rug and the shattered crystal near the wall. The trap had snapped shut. The officer asked Vanessa to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Vanessa's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. She backed away, shaking her head, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. She looked at Justin and screamed at him to do something. Justin stepped between his wife and the officers, his face pale and sweating. He tried to use his privilege as a shield. He told the police that they could not come into his house and do this. He actually asked them if they knew who he was threatening to call the mayor and have their badges stripped. The lead officer looked at my son with a mixture of boredom and pity. He informed Justin that public property records indicated this was not his house. He then explicitly warned Justin that if he interfered with a domestic violence arrest, he would be placed in handcuffs and charged with obstruction of justice. Justin froze. The bravado drained out of him in a single second. He stepped aside, leaving his wife completely defenseless. The metallic click of the handcuffs was something I could not hear perfectly over the phone speaker, but I could clearly see the cold steel closing around Vanessa's wrists. The reality of the situation crashed down on her all at once. Patricia began to shriek, waving her arms frantically and crying out that her daughter had done nothing wrong. Gary stood completely still in the living room, his cowardice fully exposed as he watched his daughter getting arrested without lifting a single finger to help her. Vanessa began to sob loudly, the ugly and messy tears of someone who suddenly realizes that their arrogant actions have real devastating consequences. She begged Justin to call a lawyer. She begged her father to help her. No one moved. The officers walked Vanessa out the front door, her hands bound tightly behind her back. The strobing red and blue lights washed over her pale, tear-stained face, illuminating her complete humiliation for all the neighbors to see. Justin followed them out to the driveway, pacing back and forth, shouting empty threats about lawsuits and ruined careers at the police vehicles. The officers ignored him entirely. They placed Vanessa in the back of the squad car and firmly closed the door. The vehicles pulled away smoothly, leaving my son standing completely alone in the dark driveway of a house he did not own, shivering in the cold night air. I watched Justin walk slowly back into the foyer and close the heavy oak door. He leaned his forehead against the wood, his hands trembling as he pulled out his phone, presumably to figure out how to bail his wife out of jail on a holiday weekend. Inside the house, Gary and Patricia were arguing loudly, their dreams of free luxury housing collapsing around them in real time. I locked my phone screen and placed the device on the passenger seat of my car. The throbbing pain in my forehead felt significantly less intense now. I started the engine, the quiet hum of the luxury sedan filling the silent parking lot. As an engineer, I knew exactly how to dismantle a structure safely and efficiently. You do not hit the walls. You systematically remove the load-bearing supports until the entire building collapses under its own weight. The structural integrity of their marriage, their pride, and their entitlement had just sustained a massive, unrecoverable blow. Phase 1 was perfectly complete, and I was only just getting started. I did not return to my sprawling estate that night. The quiet halls would only remind me of the blood that had been spilled on my dining room rug. Instead, I drove directly to the private downtown residence of my attorney, Mr. Lawson. He was a man who did not believe in regular business hours when it came to protecting his clients. He was waiting for me in his mahogany-paneled study, wearing a perfectly tailored suit despite the late hour, with a stack of freshly printed legal documents resting on his desk. He poured me a glass of aged scotch, handed me a pen, and told me that the judge had already reviewed the emergency room report and the police statement. I sat in the heavy leather chair, the dull ache in my forehead masked by the smooth burn of the scotch. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the dotted lines, executing a comprehensive emergency restraining order. This was not a simple piece of paper. It was a fortress of legal protection. It legally barred Justin Vanessa and her parasitic parents from coming within 500 feet of me, my vehicles, or my estate. Mr. Lawson had already dispatched private security contractors to my property. They were instructed to escort Gary and Patricia off the premises immediately and change every lock on the doors. My home was officially sealed. As I watched Mr. Lawson organize the signed documents, a profound and heavy silence washed over me. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The invisible chains of paternal obligation were finally broken. I leaned my head back against the chair and let my mind drift to the woman who used to make that massive estate feel like a home. My late wife Beatrice was a woman of infinite warmth and boundless forgiveness. She had a way of softening the sharp edges of the world. When Justin was growing up, Beatrice was the one who smoothed over his mistakes. She was the one who convinced me to be gentle when he failed a class or wrecked his first car. She loved him with a blinding, unconditional intensity that shielded him from the harsh realities of consequence. But when Beatrice passed away, that shield vanished, leaving Justin and me to face each other without her mediation. It did not take long for me to realize that the son we had raised was completely hollow inside. He did not mourn his mother. Not truly. In the weeks following her funeral, while I could barely summon the strength to get out of bed, Justin was already hovering around my home office, asking pointed questions about life insurance payouts and the title to the estate. He treated Beatrice's death not as a devastating emotional loss, but as a financial transition period. He assumed that because I was heartbroken and exhausted, I would simply hand over the reins of my wealth. Then came Vanessa. When Justin married her, I tried to welcome her with open arms for Beatrice's sake. But Vanessa was a master of subtle extraction. Together, they began to treat me less like a grieving father and more like an obsolete automated teller machine. An ATM has no feelings, no needs, and no purpose other than to dispense cash on demand. And when it stops dispensing, people get frustrated and hit the machine. That was exactly what my life had become. The financial drain started with small, perfectly disguised emergencies. Justin came to me 2 years ago claiming his marketing firm was going under due to unexpected market shifts. He asked for a temporary loan of $50,000, promising to pay it back with interest. I wrote the check because the house was so incredibly quiet, and I desperately wanted my son to keep visiting me. I wanted to buy his affection, but the loan was never repaid. 6 months later, Vanessa tearfully told me that her grandmother was terribly ill overseas, and they desperately needed $15,000 for emergency medical flights. I paid it without hesitation. A week later, I saw photos on social media of Justin and Vanessa drinking champagne on a luxury yacht in the Caribbean. When I confronted Justin about it, he brushed it off, claiming they needed the vacation to manage their stress, and that I was being completely unreasonable for tracking his movements. I allowed the disrespect to continue because I was terrified of being entirely alone. I let them use my credit cards for expensive dinners. I paid for Justin's exclusive country club membership because he insisted that appearances mattered for his business. I subsidized their luxury cars. I let them treat my home like a free vacation resort. I paid the price of admission just to have my son sit across from me at the dinner table. But every time they visited, they looked at me with thinly veiled impatience. They looked at my antique furniture, my property, and my investment portfolios with hungry, calculating eyes. They were simply waiting for me to die. Tonight, when Vanessa threw that heavy crystal glass at my face, she shattered the very last illusion I held onto. The pain in my forehead was nothing compared to the absolute clarity it brought me. I was no longer a grieving widow, desperately trying to hold on to a fractured family. I was a structural engineer, and I was about to demolish a building that was completely rotten to its core. My phone vibrated on Mr. Lawson's desk. It was an update from the private investigator Mr. Lawson had assigned to monitor the police precinct. I read the message and felt a cold, satisfying smile spread across my face. Justin was currently experiencing the brutal reality of the legal system. He had spent the last 3 hours pacing the filthy fluorescent-lit waiting room of the downtown police station, desperately trying to arrange bail for his wife. He had been forced to surrender his designer watch and empty his wallet just to pay the bondsman. When Vanessa was finally released from her holding cell, her expensive Easter dress was stained and wrinkled. Her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and she was sobbing uncontrollably. The arrogant, entitled woman who had demanded my home just a few hours earlier was completely broken, but their nightmare was only just beginning. As they walked out of the precinct, exhausted and humiliated, a uniformed officer stepped directly into their path. He handed Justin a thick manila envelope containing the emergency restraining order. The investigator's text detailed the exact moment Justin read the documents under the flickering streetlights. He realized that they were legally barred from returning to my estate. He realized that the private security contractors had already removed Gary and Patricia from the premises, leaving his in-laws stranded on the street with their luggage. Justin and Vanessa were standing in the cold downtown air at 3 a.m. with absolutely nowhere to go. They could not go back to my house. They could not go back to Gary and Patricia's foreclosed condominium. They were homeless. I pictured Justin standing on that sidewalk, holding the legal papers that stripped him of his perceived kingdom. I knew exactly what his next move would be. Justin had always relied on my safety nets to catch him when he fell. Years ago, when he first moved out of the house, I had set up a joint emergency bank account for him. I had deposited $20,000 into it, instructing him to only use it in a matter of absolute life or death. He had never touched it, simply because I had always paid for his mistakes directly out of my own pocket. Now standing on the cold concrete with a sobbing wife and stranded in laws, he would need money for a luxury hotel suite. He would need money to hire a defense attorney for Vanessa's upcoming criminal trial. He would need cash immediately, and he would reach for the emergency account I had provided. I looked up at Mr. Lawson. He nodded silently, already knowing what I was thinking. I picked up my phone and opened my banking application. I navigated to the joint emergency account that had sat untouched for years. With a few simple taps on the illuminated screen, I transferred the entire balance back into my private trust. I set the phone back down on the desk. The account balance now read exactly $0.00. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, closed my eyes, and waited for my son to realize that the automated teller machine was permanently closed. I watched the screen of my phone with the quiet satisfaction of an architect observing a perfectly executed demolition. Sitting in the leather armchair of my lawyer's study, the silence of the room was broken only by the soft ticking of a grandfather clock. It was exactly 3:18 in the morning. My banking application remained open on my screen. I did not have to wait long to see the immediate effects of my financial strike. A small notification banner slid across the top of my phone. It was an alert from my fraud protection service. A login attempt had been made on the joint emergency account from a recognized device. Justin. I could picture the scene with absolute clarity. My son was standing on the dirty illuminated sidewalk outside the downtown police precinct. The bitter night wind would be cutting through his thin designer jacket. Beside him stood his wife Vanessa. Her extravagant Easter dress ruined her wrists, likely still aching from the cold steel of the handcuffs. And now joining them on that miserable stretch of concrete would be Gary and Patricia. My private security team had successfully deposited them on the curb outside my estate, forcing them to pay for a late-night cab ride downtown just to find their daughter fresh out of a holding cell. They were all looking to Justin. For years, Justin had played the role of the wealthy, successful entrepreneur. He had paraded my money around as if he had earned it himself. He had promised Vanessa a life of endless luxury, and he had promised his entitled in-laws that they would never have to worry about a mortgage again. Standing on that sidewalk facing the fury of three deeply materialistic people who had just been rendered homeless, Justin would have puffed out his chest. He would have told them to calm down. He would have confidently promised to book them 2 adjoining suites at the Four Seasons. He would have assured Vanessa that he was going to hire the most ruthless criminal defense attorney in the state to sue the police department and crush me in court. To fund this arrogant fantasy, Justin pulled out his smartphone. He opened his banking application, typing in his password with frantic, freezing fingers. He navigated to the emergency fund, the account that had held $20,000 of my money for nearly a decade. He expected to see a safety net. He expected to see his salvation. Instead, he saw a balance of exactly $0.00. I received a second notification on my phone. An overdraft alert. Justin had attempted to wire $5,000 from the zeroed account to his personal checking account. The transaction was instantly denied. A minute later, a third notification appeared. He tried to transfer $2,000. Denied. Then $500. Denied. The decreasing amounts told a pathetic story of a man whose arrogance was rapidly dissolving into sheer, unadulterated panic. I knew the exact physiological response he was experiencing. His heart would be hammering against his ribs. His stomach would drop into an endless void. For 36 years, Justin had lived with a golden parachute strapped to his back. Every time he jumped out of an airplane without a plan, I had pulled the cord for him. Tonight he had jumped, reached for the cord, and found absolutely nothing. But the humiliation did not stop with the empty bank account. Desperation breeds foolishness. I watched my phone screen as a new alert popped up from a completely different financial institution. It was the Platinum corporate credit card I had given him 2 years ago to help cover legitimate business expenses for his marketing firm. A charge for $850 was attempted at a luxury downtown hotel. I had canceled that card while driving to the hospital. The charge was declined. A minute later, a charge for $300 at a much cheaper motel chain was attempted. Declined. The financial blockade was absolute. I had severed every single artery of wealth that fed his bloated lifestyle. The dynamic on that cold sidewalk must have been spectacular to witness. When Justin finally looked up from his glowing screen and admitted that the money was gone, the fragile alliance of parasites would have instantly turned on itself. Gary, who just hours earlier had demanded a free wing in my house, would have started shouting. Patricia would have accused Justin of being a fraud and a failure. And Vanessa, the woman who threw a crystal glass at my head because I refused to surrender my property, would realize that she had married a man who actually owned nothing. She had assaulted an elderly man, secured herself a criminal record, and ruined her comfortable life, all for a husband who could not even afford to buy her a hot cup of coffee at a diner. My phone suddenly began to vibrate in the palm of my hand. The caller ID displayed Justin's name. Mr. Lawson looked up from his paperwork, raising a questioning eyebrow. I simply smiled, placed the phone face up on the mahogany desk, and let it ring. I watched the screen glow brightly in the dim study, the vibration buzzing against the wood. I did not decline the call. I simply let it ring until it rolled over to voicemail. 30 seconds later, a new voicemail notification appeared. I tapped the screen and put the message on speakerphone so my attorney could hear the immediate results of our labor. The audio quality was poor, filled with the sound of roaring traffic and howling wind. But my son's voice came through with terrifying clarity. He was breathing heavily, his words tumbling out in a frantic, aggressive rush. "Dad, pick up the phone. Pick up the damn phone right now. I am at the ATM and the emergency account is empty. The credit cards are declining. Vanessa is freezing and her parents have nowhere to go. You cannot do this. You cannot just lock us out and steal our money. I am going to call the police on you for financial theft if you do not wire funds into my account in the next 5 minutes. You are acting like a crazy person. Call me back before I ruin you." The message ended with a sharp click. Mr. Lawson let out a low, dry chuckle. "Steal his money," the lawyer repeated, shaking his head. "The delusion is truly staggering. He assaults you in your own dining room and then threatens to call the police on you because you stopped paying his allowance." I reached over and deleted the voicemail. It was a pathetic, empty threat from a man who had not yet grasped the full magnitude of his destruction. He still believed he was in control. He still believed he could order me around, threaten me with public embarrassment, and bully me into compliance. He genuinely thought the zero balance was a temporary temper tantrum on my part. He thought I was just trying to teach him a lesson, and that I would eventually cave to his demands. He did not understand that I was not trying to teach him a lesson. I was evicting him from my life entirely. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and buttoned my coat. The physical pain in my forehead was completely eclipsed by the cold, mechanical focus driving my actions. Phase 1 and 2 were successfully executed. The physical boundary was established with the restraining order, and the financial blockade was fully operational. But cutting off his allowance was merely a defensive maneuver. Now it was time to move on to the offensive. It was time to trigger the legal mechanisms that would ensure Justin and Vanessa could never lay claim to a single dime of the legacy Beatrice and I had built. I thanked Mr. Lawson for his late-night hospitality and walked out into the crisp pre-dawn air. The city was quiet, but the war had officially begun. Justin was about to learn the difference between inherited arrogance and earned power. The pale light of dawn was just beginning to bleed across the city skyline when my phone vibrated in the cup holder of my car. I was parked near the marina watching the dark water lap against the concrete pillars. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. Justin had apparently found a convenience store open early enough to purchase a prepaid cellular device. He was blocked on my primary line due to the emergency injunction, but desperation makes people resourceful. I picked up the device and accepted the call without saying a word. I let the silence stretch over the open line. "Dad, are you there?" Justin shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and raw panic. "Do not hang up on me. You cannot do this. You have to lift the block on the accounts right now. Vanessa has a court date on Tuesday, and the lawyers want a $10,000 retainer by noon today. I am freezing. We are sitting in a cheap diner and I cannot even afford to buy breakfast for Gary and Patricia." He was still giving me orders. Even after spending the night on the street, even after his wife was hauled away in handcuffs, my son still believed he possessed the authority to demand my wealth. He viewed the frozen accounts as a temper tantrum, a temporary punishment that he could simply yell his way out of. I watched a seagull land on the hood of my car. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself in the absolute certainty of my decisions. "Justin," I said, my voice completely devoid of anger or warmth, "I am not lifting the block on the accounts. I am not paying for your hotel. I am certainly not funding the legal defense of the woman who assaulted me in my own dining room." "Dad, it was an accident." Justin pleaded, his tone shifting frantically from aggressive to begging. "She was just stressed. You provoked her by insulting her parents. You know how she gets. You cannot just cut off your own flesh and blood over a broken wine glass." I let out a slow, measured breath. A broken wine glass. That was how he was categorizing a physical attack that required hospital intervention. He was minimizing the violence to protect his access to my wallet. "It was not a broken glass, Justin. It was aggravated assault," I replied, enunciating every syllable so there could be no misunderstanding. "And because you are clearly struggling to comprehend the gravity of your situation, I am going to explain the mechanics of your ruin very clearly." I paused, letting the cold reality of the morning settle over the phone line. "When your mother and I established the Family Living Trust 20 years ago, I approached it exactly how I approached designing commercial skyscrapers. I looked for the weak points. I calculated the stress loads, and I installed fail-safes to ensure the structure would not collapse under toxic pressure. One of those fail-safes was a strict morality clause." "What are you talking about?" Justin stammered, the panic in his voice escalating. "I am talking about a legally binding stipulation written directly into the foundation of your inheritance," I explained smoothly. "The clause explicitly states that if any beneficiary or the legal spouse of any beneficiary commits a felony offense against the grantor, they are immediately, automatically, and irrevocably disinherited." The line went dead silent. I could hear the faint, tinny sound of diner music playing in the background on his end, alongside the muffled, complaining voice of his mother-in-law. "Vanessa did not just throw a tantrum," I continued. "She committed a violent felony against me. By defending her, by prioritizing her entitlement over my physical safety, you validated that attack. The moment the police placed her in handcuffs based on my medical report, the morality clause was triggered. It is not a process I have to think about or approve. It is automatic. As of midnight last night, your legal connection to my estate, my liquid assets, and my trust was completely severed." "Dad, no, you cannot do that. You are bluffing." Justin gasped, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. "I do not bluff, Justin. I build things that last, and I tear down things that are broken. The emergency account is drained because it belongs to the trust. Your corporate cards are canceled because they belong to the trust. You have absolutely nothing. You are a 36-year-old man standing in a cheap diner with a violent wife and 2 parasitic in-laws, and you are entirely on your own." He began to sob. It was a pathetic, gasping sound. He begged me to reconsider. He told me that his mother would never have wanted this. He tried to weaponize the memory of Beatrice against me, claiming that she would be disgusted by my cruelty. That was his final fatal mistake. "Do not ever invoke your mother's name to justify your greed," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Your mother loved you blindly, and you used that love to bleed her dry until the day she died. You mistook her kindness for a blank check. But Beatrice is gone. You are dealing with me now, and I see you exactly for what you are." I pulled the phone away from my ear. Justin was still screaming, his voice a frantic blur of apologies and threats. I tapped the red button on the screen, cutting him off mid-sentence. I then blocked the burner number, ensuring that he could no longer reach me through that avenue. I sat back in my car and watched the sun finally crest over the water. The sky was a brilliant, bruised purple. The financial umbilical cord was officially cut. Justin and Vanessa were completely marooned, left to drown in the reality of their own actions. They would soon realize that a life funded by arrogance is a structure built on sand, and the tide was rolling in faster than they could possibly swim. I parked my luxury sedan back in the pristine garage of my estate. The morning sun was bright and unforgiving, But inside the house, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of peace you only achieve after cutting out a cancer. My phone chirped with a secure message from Mr. Lawson. He had deployed his private investigators the moment the restraining order was filed. I sat at my kitchen island and read the detailed timeline of my in-laws' mourning. Gary and Patricia were currently experiencing the brutal consequences of their own financial negligence. According to the investigator, Gary had spent the last 2 hours screaming at the manager of a cheap roadside motel. Justin had tried to book them a single room using a canceled credit card. When the transaction failed, the manager asked them to leave the lobby. They were currently sitting on a bus stop bench, surrounded by their designer luggage. Their own condominium was officially locked by the bank on Friday. They had ignored the foreclosure notices for months, believing that Vanessa would simply move them into my guest wing. They had treated my home as their inevitable safety net. Now that the net was gone, they were in free fall. Patricia was a woman who had spent her entire adult life running from the consequences of her terrible choices. She wore expensive coats, bought on credit, and carried luxury handbags she could not afford. Now sitting on a public bench, she was facing the terrifying reality of poverty. Her survival instinct kicked in, and her instinct was entirely parasitic. She needed a new host. The private investigator noted that the family dynamic was disintegrating rapidly. Patricia was blaming Justin for being a weak provider. Gary was demanding that Vanessa call me and apologize. But Vanessa could not contact me. The emergency injunction explicitly prohibited any form of communication. If she even attempted to dial my number, she would be in violation of a court order and subject to immediate arrest. Gary and Patricia, however, were not explicitly named on the emergency restraining order. The police had only escorted them off my property because they were trespassing. That meant they were legally free to approach me in public. They realized this loophole and decided to exploit it. Cornered animals are entirely predictable, and my in-laws were no exception. The report detailed a loud conversation the four of them had on that bus stop bench. Patricia had decided that legal boundaries did not apply to her. She told Gary that they needed to bypass the restraining order by staging a coincidental public encounter. They needed to find me in a place where I could not easily escape and where my reputation would be at stake. They wanted an audience. Patricia knew my schedule intimately. She knew that for 15 years I have eaten breakfast at a classic diner in the center of our town every Tuesday morning. I sit in the exact same booth. I order the exact same black coffee and eggs. It is a quiet local institution filled with retired judges, business owners, and community leaders. It is a place where reputation is currency. The investigator listened as Patricia orchestrated the ambush. She told Gary that he needed to play the role of the outraged, protective father. She would play the weeping, devastated mother. They would walk into the diner and loudly beg me to have mercy on their daughter. They would twist the narrative completely. They planned to claim that Vanessa only threw the glass because I was verbally abusing them and threatening to ruin their lives. They would frame me as an erratic tyrant who derived pleasure from torturing his own family. Gary agreed with his wife. He loudly declared that he was going to march into that diner, look me in the eye, and demand that I honor my family obligations. He was going to tell the entire room that I was leaving his poor, innocent daughter out on the street. They truly believed this cheap manipulation would work. They thought my desire to maintain a pristine image in our affluent community would override my common sense. They calculated that I would gladly write a $50,000 check and drop the assault charges just to avoid a massive scene in front of my peers. I locked my phone and set it on the marble counter. A normal man would have altered his schedule. A normal man would have stayed hidden inside his gated estate to avoid the sheer embarrassment of a screaming match over eggs and coffee. But I am not a normal man. I spent my entire career designing structures that could withstand hurricanes and earthquakes. You do not hide from the storm. You let it hit the reinforced glass, and you watch it break. I went upstairs and took a hot shower. I shaved carefully, making sure to avoid the fresh stitches above my eyebrow. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. I wanted to look exactly like the man they were trying to destroy. powerful, unbothered, and entirely out of their league. They wanted to use public shame as a weapon against me. They did not realize that shame only works on people who have something to hide. I had nothing to hide. I had a bleeding forehead from a violent attack and a mountain of financial evidence proving their parasitism. I had absolutely no problem defending my boundaries in the middle of a crowded room. I checked my watch. It was nearing 8 o'clock in the morning. The diner would be packed with the morning rush. The stage was perfectly set for their theatrical ambush. I picked up my keys and walked out to my car. I was going to buy myself a cup of black coffee, and I was going to let Gary and Patricia dig their own graves in front of the entire town. The bell above the diner door jingled as I walked inside. The smell of roasted coffee beans and fried bacon hung thick in the warm air. The morning rush was in full swing. Local politicians sat in the corner booths. Business owners leaned over their plates, reading the morning paper. I nodded to the manager and walked directly to my usual booth in the back. The waitress brought my black coffee without me having to ask. I thanked her and took a slow sip. The dark roast was bitter and perfect. I sat in the corner observing the room. I was ready. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door swung open. Gary and Patricia walked inside. They looked completely out of place among the working professionals. Patricia had dark circles under her eyes, and her expensive coat looked wrinkled from her night on the street. Gary was red in the face. They scanned the crowded room until their eyes locked onto my booth. I did not look away. I took another sip of my coffee and placed the porcelain mug quietly on the saucer. They marched across the checkered floor. Patricia began to dab her eyes with a tissue before she even reached my table. She was warming up her tears for the audience. Gary stopped abruptly in front of my booth. He slammed both of his hands down on my table. The silverware rattled against the plates. Several people at the surrounding tables stopped eating and looked over. Gary puffed out his chest and raised his voice so the entire diner could hear him. "Douglas, you are a monster!" Gary shouted, projecting his voice toward the back wall. "You are a cruel, selfish old man. You threw my poor daughter out on the street. You forced her to spend the night in a jail cell. She is terrified of you." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob. She pressed the tissue to her face and wailed. "We treated you like family, Douglas. We loved you and Justin, and you repaid us by making us homeless. You are abusing your own son. You cut off his money just to punish him." The diner went completely silent. The clinking of coffee cups stopped. The low hum of morning conversations vanished entirely. Every single eye in the room was fixed on my booth. A retired judge sitting 2 tables away frowned and lowered his newspaper. A local bank manager watched with a mixture of shock and curiosity. The stage was fully set just as Patricia had planned on that bus stop bench. They expected me to shrink in my seat. They expected me to look around in a panic and beg them to lower their voices. They assumed I would do absolutely anything to silence their public accusations. I did not shrink. I did not panic. I simply picked up my coffee mug and took another slow, measured sip. The warm liquid washed down my throat. I looked at Gary and Patricia with the absolute emotional detachment of a man studying an insect under a microscope. The stitches on my forehead were clearly visible under the harsh diner lights. The neat black thread binding my split skin told the real story of their innocent daughter. "Gary," I said, my voice completely calm and level, "you are standing in my light. Please take a step back." Gary blinked in confusion. My lack of shame completely derailed his script. He leaned closer, attempting to physically intimidate me. "I am not stepping back, Douglas," Gary growled loudly. "I am going to stand right here until you agree to drop those fake assault charges against Vanessa. You are going to lift the restraining order, and you are going to restore the bank accounts of my son-in-law. You owe us for the emotional damage you caused last night." Patricia continued to weep, wiping her dry eyes. "Everyone is looking at you, Douglas," she whined loudly. "Everyone can see exactly what kind of man you are. You should be ashamed of yourself. How can you sit there and drink your coffee while your family suffers?" I slowly turned my head and looked at the audience they had so desperately wanted to gather. I made eye contact with the retired judge. I offered him a polite nod. He nodded back, his expression unreadable. I looked back at Gary. The town was indeed watching me. They were watching a man who refused to negotiate with emotional terrorists. I set my coffee mug down. I folded my hands together and rested them on the edge of the table. "You are making a terrible mistake, Gary," I said, speaking softly enough that he had to lean in to hear me. "You walked into a public place attempting to extort me using shame as your primary weapon. But you forgot one crucial detail. I am the one with the bleeding forehead. I am the one with the police report. I am the one with the forensic accounting audit proving your daughter married a thief." Gary opened his mouth to shout another accusation, but the words died in his throat. He looked at my forehead. He looked at my calm, unblinking eyes. He realized that the crowd was not muttering in sympathy for him. The crowd was staring at his aggressive posture and my visible injuries. The performance was failing. Patricia stopped fake crying. She lowered her tissue and glared at me with pure venom. She realized that her tears were completely useless against a man who no longer cared about her existence. She nudged Gary, whispering that they needed to try something else. They were realizing that they had brought a public tantrum to a legal slaughter. They thought they had cornered me in my favorite diner. They had absolutely no idea that I had lured them into a trap. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I felt the smooth, thick paper of the legal envelope waiting inside. It was time to show Gary and Patricia what real power looked like. I withdrew my hand from the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I held a thick, crisp, white envelope. I placed it flat on the table right next to my coffee saucer. I pushed it slowly across the polished surface until the edge touched Gary's trembling fingers. "Open it, Gary," I said. My voice was calm and steady. "You wanted to discuss financial obligations in front of the entire town, so let us discuss your financial obligations." Gary looked at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Patricia nudged him sharply. He snatched it up, tore the seal, and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. His eyes scanned the first page. His heavy brow furrowed in confusion. I did not wait for him to comprehend the legal jargon. I explained it to him loudly enough for the retired judge 2 tables away to hear every single word. 6 months ago, when Justin first mentioned that you were facing foreclosure, I decided to look into your finances. I discovered that you had remortgaged your condominium 3 times. You were drowning in debt, and you expected my son to use my money to bail you out. That is when I instructed Mr. Lawson to set up a private shell company. I named it Beatrice Holdings in honor of my late wife. That company purchased the entirety of your defaulted debt directly from your bank. Gary dropped the papers on the table. The blood drained completely from his face. Patricia snatched the documents and began reading frantically, her eyes widening with every line. I took another sip of my coffee. "I am not just the man you tried to publicly humiliate, Gary. I am your primary creditor. You do not just owe the bank, you owe me. The foreclosure sale of your condo did not cover the total balance of your loans. You have a massive deficiency judgment hanging over your heads. And because you are currently in default, I have instructed my legal team to pursue the maximum collection actions permitted by state law. I will be garnishing your wages. I will be seizing your remaining assets. I will ensure that every single penny you owe me is squeezed from your pockets for the rest of your natural lives." Patricia dropped the papers. Her hands were shaking violently. The arrogance that had fueled her theatrical tears evaporated instantly. She looked at me and finally saw the reality of her situation. She was looking at a man who held the absolute power to ruin her and who felt absolutely no remorse in doing so. Gary tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He opened his mouth and let out a dry, pathetic gasp. "I suggest you leave this diner," I told them softly. "And I suggest you find a very cheap lawyer because you are going to need one." Gary grabbed his wife by the arm. They did not shout. They did not make another threat. They turned around and practically ran toward the heavy glass door, pushing past a group of startled customers. The bell jingled loudly as they fled out into the cold morning air. I picked up my coffee mug and finished the last dark, bitter drop. The diner remained completely quiet for a moment, before the low hum of morning conversations slowly resumed. The audience had witnessed the execution, and they were satisfied. I signaled the waitress for the check, but before she could reach my table, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled the device out and unlocked the screen. I had a new text message from an unknown number. I knew immediately it was Justin using yet another prepaid phone. I opened the message. There was no text at first, just an image file. I tapped the image to enlarge it. It was a scanned copy of a medical document. I read the letterhead. It belonged to a local private clinic. I read the patient name. It was my name. I read the diagnosis printed clearly at the bottom of the page. Advanced early onset dementia with severe cognitive decline and aggressive paranoia. The document was signed by a doctor I had never met. It was a complete and total forgery. Justin and Vanessa had actually paid someone to fabricate a medical history, proving I was mentally incompetent. They planned to use my bleeding forehead and my decision to cut them off as evidence of my supposed paranoia. A second message arrived immediately after the image. The text was short and dripping with arrogant desperation. "We are taking over the estate, old man. You are sick and you need help. We have the medical proof. See you in court." I stared at the glowing screen. Justin actually believed a piece of forged paper would save him. He thought he could outsmart a structural engineer by presenting a faulty blueprint. He did not realize that presenting forged medical documents to a judge is a severe felony. He was handing me the exact rope I needed to hang him. I placed a $20 bill on the table to cover my coffee and the tip. I stood up, smoothed my suit jacket, and walked out of the diner. The morning sun was bright. The air was crisp. My son wanted to see me in court. I smiled a cold, quiet smile. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. I forwarded the image of the forged medical diagnosis directly to Mr. Lawson. I did not include a long explanation. I simply typed a single sentence. "Look at the trap my son just set for himself." Mr. Lawson called me less than 2 minutes later. His voice carried the distinct, sharp amusement of a predator watching its prey wander blindly into a cage. He informed me that Justin had officially retained legal counsel. Because I had completely severed their access to my wealth, Justin and Vanessa could not afford a reputable downtown law firm. My private investigator sent me a brief background profile on their new attorney. His name was Richard Vance. He operated out of a cramped office in a decaying strip mall on the edge of town. He was a desperate, aggressive lawyer, known for taking on frivolous personal injury claims and settling them for pennies. He was exactly the kind of man who would look at a forged medical document and see a massive payday instead of a federal crime. The investigator outlined the flurry of activity happening at that cheap law office. Vanessa was still wearing sunglasses to hide her bloodshot eyes from crying all night in a holding cell. Justin was pacing the stained carpet of the waiting room, spinning a frantic web of lies to his new lawyer. They were building a narrative completely detached from reality. Their strategy was as transparent as it was pathetic. They planned to use the fake early-onset dementia diagnosis to file an emergency petition for conservatorship. They wanted a judge to declare me entirely incompetent to handle my own affairs. Justin firmly believed that if he could just secure a legal power of attorney, he could seize control of the estate, unfreeze the bank accounts, and dismiss the domestic assault charges against his wife. He actually thought he could sign a document on my behalf, legally, forgiving Vanessa for splitting my head open with a crystal glass. It was a masterclass in monumental arrogance. They had convinced this strip mall lawyer that I was a confused, fragile old man hoarding millions of dollars in a state of severe paranoia. They told him my decision to lock them out of the house was a sudden psychotic break. They promised Richard Vance a massive percentage of my estate if he could just bully me into signing over control before the court systems got too heavily involved. Later that afternoon, Mr. Lawson received a formal email from Richard Vance. The email was a chaotic, aggressive list of demands masquerading as a legal settlement. Vance demanded an immediate sit-down meeting at my attorney's office. He threatened that if I did not appear and sign the power of attorney documents voluntarily, he would take the forged medical records directly to a judge and have me forcibly committed to a psychiatric facility. He explicitly stated that Vanessa would graciously agree not to sue me for emotional distress if I dropped the criminal charges against her. I sat in my home office sipping a glass of sparkling water. I read the email 3 times. I marveled at the sheer reckless stupidity of what they were attempting. They were holding a fabricated medical document and trying to use it to blackmail a man who spent his life analyzing structural integrity. They were trying to threaten me with a piece of paper that could send all 3 of them to federal prison for a very long time. Forging a medical diagnosis is a severe crime. Transmitting that forgery across state lines or digital networks is wire fraud. Attempting to use it to extort assets from a senior citizen carries mandatory minimum sentencing. Justin and Vanessa were so blinded by their greed and their desperate need to avoid poverty that they could no longer see the legal avalanche hanging directly over their heads. Mr. Lawson asked me over the phone if I wanted to simply report the forgery to the police and have them arrested immediately. I told him no. Arresting them now would be too quick. It would give them an opportunity to claim they were tricked or that the doctor gave them the document by mistake. I needed them to own their crime completely and absolutely. I needed them to walk into a professional environment and present that forged document with their own 2 hands. I told Mr. Lawson to accept the meeting. I told him to invite Justin, Vanessa, and their cheap lawyer to his pristine downtown boardroom the following morning. I wanted them to walk into that room feeling victorious. I wanted them to sit across the polished oak table and lay out their demands. I wanted them to feel the absolute highest peak of misguided confidence right before I removed the floor from beneath their feet. I looked at the fresh stitches reflected in my office mirror. The pain was gone, replaced entirely by a cold, focused energy. My son believed he was coming to collect an empire. He had no idea he was walking directly into an execution chamber. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my attorney's downtown office. Mr. Lawson and I sat on one side of a massive polished oak table. We had arrived an hour early to ensure every document was perfectly positioned. The room smelled of expensive leather and fresh coffee. I wore my charcoal suit. The stitches on my forehead throbbed slightly, but my mind was perfectly still. I watched the heavy glass doors. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors swung open. Justin walked in first. He wore a navy suit he had undoubtedly bought with my money. His chin was held high. He carried himself with the bloated confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Vanessa followed close behind him. She wore a tight beige dress and oversized dark sunglasses. She kept her head tilted upward, trying to mask the reality that she had spent a night in a holding cell. Their new attorney, Richard Vance, trailed behind them. He carried a scuffed vinyl briefcase and looked around the pristine boardroom with wide, nervous eyes. He was clearly intimidated by the sheer wealth radiating from Mr. Lawson's office. Mr. Lawson did not stand to greet them. He simply gestured toward the empty leather chairs across the table. Justin pulled out a chair for his wife and sat down directly across from me. He leaned back and crossed his arms. He looked at the bandage on my forehead and offered a small, patronizing smile. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not apologize. He looked at me as if I were a confused child who needed to be disciplined. Richard Vance cleared his throat and opened his vinyl briefcase. He pulled out a stack of papers and slapped them onto the oak table. He tried to project an aura of aggressive authority. He announced that we were here to resolve a tragic family misunderstanding before things got ugly in court. He said his clients were willing to be generous, considering my rapidly deteriorating mental condition. I did not speak. I simply folded my hands on the table and let them talk. Justin leaned forward, placing his elbows on the polished wood. "Dad, this has gone far enough," he said, using a slow, exaggerated tone. "You locked us out of the house. You froze the accounts. You actually had the police arrest Vanessa over a simple accident. We know you are not in your right mind. We know you are sick." Vanessa removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were puffy, but her expression was pure venom. "We just want to get you the help you desperately need, Douglas," she added. "We are trying to protect you from yourself." Justin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table toward Mr. Lawson. He declared that it was a certified medical diagnosis from a private clinic. He stated with absolute conviction that the document proved I was suffering from advanced early-onset dementia. He claimed it proved I was experiencing aggressive paranoia and that my recent actions were the result of a severe cognitive decline. Mr. Lawson picked up the paper. He adjusted his glasses and read the forged diagnosis in complete silence. He looked at Richard Vance and asked if this document was being submitted onto the official legal record for this meeting. Vance puffed out his chest and confirmed that it was absolutely official. Mr. Lawson placed the document carefully into a clear plastic folder. He thanked them for submitting it. Justin mistook my attorney's calm demeanor for submission. He smiled broadly, genuinely, believing that the forged paper had just secured his empire. "Now here are our terms," Justin said, leaning back in his chair again. "We are not going to put you in a facility, Dad. We are going to let you stay in the house, but you need full-time supervision. I have a power of attorney document right here. You are going to sign it today. It gives me full executive control over the estate, the living trust, and all financial accounts." He tapped his finger against the table to emphasize his demands. "Once you sign the transfer, you are going to call the district attorney. You are going to tell them you were confused and that Vanessa never assaulted you. You will drop all charges immediately. If you do exactly as I say, we will take care of you. If you refuse, we will take this medical diagnosis to a judge today and have you declared legally incompetent. You will lose everything anyway, and Vanessa will sue you for false imprisonment." Justin slid the power of attorney contract across the table. He placed a silver pen right next to it. He looked at me with an expression of absolute triumph. He believed he had cornered me. He believed his cheap lawyer and his forged document had checkmated a man who built commercial skyscrapers for a living. I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the forged medical document resting safely inside my attorney's plastic folder. I looked at my son. He was so completely blinded by his own greed that he could not see the massive legal trap closing around his throat. He had just officially submitted a forged document during a recorded legal proceeding to extort a senior citizen. I did not reach for the pen. I remained perfectly silent, observing him. I let the quiet tension build in the room until Justin's smug smile began to falter. He shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. He demanded to know why I was not signing the paper. He demanded to know why I was just staring at him. He was completely unaware that he had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. I did not pick up the silver pen. I did not look at the forged medical document. I simply looked at my son. The silence in the room grew incredibly heavy. Justin had always hated silence. When he was a boy, silence meant he was in trouble. He would talk endlessly to fill the void, hoping to talk his way out of a punishment. He was doing the exact same thing right now. He shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. He leaned forward and pointed a finger at me. Since I was not speaking, he decided to fill the empty air with his grand vision. He began laying out exactly what he planned to do with my estate once I signed the documents. He told me that my house was far too large for one person. He stated that Gary and Patricia would be moving into the guest wing by the end of the weekend. He detailed how he was going to liquidate my private stock portfolio to expand his failing marketing firm. He was spending my money right in front of me, outlining a premeditated financial takeover with absolute arrogance. I kept my facial expression perfectly still. My complete lack of reaction began to infuriate him. His voice grew louder and more aggressive. He admitted that finding the joint bank account empty had caused him severe public humiliation. He explicitly stated that if I did not sign the power of attorney today, he would ensure I was locked away in a state psychiatric facility. He threatened my freedom and my sanity in direct exchange for my signature. He was handing me the absolute definition of criminal extortion on a silver platter. Richard Vance was eager to earn his massive illicit payday, so the cheap lawyer decided to join the monologue. He leaned across the polished oak table and tapped his finger against the forged medical record. He told me that the district attorney would look very unfavorably upon a confused old man wasting police resources. He reiterated that Vanessa would graciously drop her fabricated emotional distress claims the moment the assault charges were wiped away. He was legally tying the dismissal of a violent felony to a forced financial transaction. He was a licensed attorney openly committing blackmail. I glanced at the small, blinking red light in the center of the table. Mr. Lawson always recorded official dispute meetings. I had explicitly requested the recording device be placed in plain sight when we set the appointment. Justin and his lawyer had signed a standard consent form in the lobby without even reading the fine print. Every single threat, every admission of blackmail, and every detail of their extortion plot was being captured in pristine high-definition audio. They were digging a massive legal grave and eagerly jumping inside. Vanessa could not resist adding her own venom to the conversation. She removed her oversized sunglasses, entirely showing her puffy eyes and smeared makeup. She told me that I owed her financial compensation for the severe trauma of being arrested and placed in a holding cell. She admitted out loud that throwing the heavy crystal glass was just a momentary lapse in judgment. She called it a minor mistake that I had blown wildly out of proportion. She confessed to the violent assault right on the official record. She actually stated that she only threw the glass because I was being stubborn about giving her parents the guest wing. She provided her own motive and confession without me having to ask a single question. I let them empty their arsenals. I let them lay all their desperate cards on the table. As a structural engineer, I know that a poorly constructed building will always reveal its fatal flaws if you just let the wind hit it long enough. They were so desperate to secure my wealth and so terrified of the poverty awaiting them outside this building that they abandoned all legal caution. They provided motive, intent, and confession in one unbroken stream of arrogant dialogue. Finally, Justin ran out of breath. He pointed to the silver pen one last time. He demanded that I sign the paper and end this pathetic charade. He told me it was my very last chance to keep my dignity and stay out of a nursing home. I slowly unclasped my hands. I reached out across the polished wood and picked up the silver pen. Justin smiled a wide and victorious grin. Vanessa let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. They thought the heavy silence had broken me. They thought I was surrendering to their demands. But I did not bring the pen to the paper. I placed it gently on the opposite side of my coffee cup, entirely out of his reach. I looked at Mr. Lawson and gave him a single quiet nod. It was time to show my son exactly what a real structural collapse looked like. Mr. Lawson did not say a single word when I gave him the signal. He simply reached down into his open leather briefcase resting on the floor beside his chair. When he brought his hands back above the table, he was holding a massive black binder. It was easily 4 inches thick and filled with hundreds of crisp pages. He placed it directly in the center of the polished oak table. The heavy thud of the binder echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom, shattering the arrogant atmosphere Justin had tried to build. I looked at Richard Vance. I told the cheap lawyer that the medical document he had just submitted to the official record was a complete fabrication. I informed him that I had undergone a comprehensive psychological and physical evaluation just 48 hours ago by 3 independent board-certified physicians. I possessed legally binding affidavits proving my absolute mental clarity and competence. I watched the color drain completely from the lawyer's face as the reality of his situation set in. He realized he had just attached his professional name and his legal license to a federal crime involving forged medical records and the attempted extortion of a senior citizen. Then I turned my attention back to my son. I told Justin that I did not bring him to this downtown office to negotiate my freedom. I brought him here to discuss his theft. Justin tried to laugh, but the sound was weak and breathless. He asked what I was talking about. He tried to maintain his posture, but his eyes kept darting nervously toward the thick black binder resting on the table. I reminded Justin of the conversation we had 3 years ago, right after his mother passed away. He had come to me claiming he wanted to learn the family business. He told me he wanted to take on more responsibility and prove he was capable of managing my commercial real estate empire. I told him that as an experienced structural engineer, I never put a massive load on an untested support beam. You have to test the materials first to see if they will crack under pressure. So I gave him executive access to a single minor operating account for a small logistics subsidiary. It was an account I rarely monitored personally. It was a silent test of his fundamental integrity. I looked at Vanessa, who was staring at the black binder with growing apprehension. I told them that a man of true integrity would have grown that business account or simply maintained it responsibly. But Justin was not a man of integrity. He was a parasite who only knew how to consume the resources of others. I placed my hand flat on the heavy black binder. I explained that inside these pages was a complete forensic audit conducted by my lead forensic accountant over the past 48 hours. Every single transaction, every wire transfer, and every automated teller withdrawal from that minor business account had been meticulously tracked, documented, and categorized. I opened the heavy cover and flipped directly to the executive summary page. I read the numbers out loud, so the recording device in the center of the table would capture every single syllable. $140,000. That was the exact amount of corporate funds Justin had illegally siphoned into his personal checking accounts over the last 24 months. He had not used the money for legitimate business expenses or marketing investments. He had used it to fund the complete illusion of a luxury lifestyle that he could not actually afford. I looked directly at Vanessa to ensure she understood her role in this destruction. I listed the specific purchases highlighted in the forensic audit. The designer handbags she paraded around my home as if she had earned them. The lavish weekend trips to 5-star tropical resorts while they claimed to be visiting sick relatives. The expensive jewelry she wore to my Easter dinner right before she threw a crystal glass at my face. Every single item and experience was purchased with stolen corporate funds. Justin had been actively embezzling money from his grieving father just to buy the temporary affection of a deeply entitled woman. The smug arrogance that had defined Justin since he walked into the boardroom evaporated entirely. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the thick binder as if it were an active explosive device waiting to detonate. He realized that while he was busy forging fake medical documents and plotting a hostile takeover of my estate, I had been quietly compiling a mountain of irrefutable financial evidence against him. I had allowed him to dig his own grave one unauthorized transaction at a time. Richard Vance leaned forward and stared at the open audit pages. The cheap lawyer was sweating profusely now. He was looking at official bank records, wire fraud evidence, and a mathematically perfect paper trail of corporate embezzlement. He suddenly understood that his client was not a wealthy heir attempting to secure his rightful estate. His client was a desperate criminal who had just confessed to extortion on tape while holding a forged medical document. I closed the heavy binder with a sharp snap. The sound made Justin flinch in his leather chair. I told my son that he had spent the last 3 years treating me like an obsolete machine meant to dispense cash. He had mistaken my quiet grief for blindness. He had mistaken my patience for stupidity. And now he was going to face the brutal consequences of testing a structure that was built to withstand an earthquake. Justin tried to speak, but his voice was nothing more than a hoarse whisper. He asked me what I was going to do with the audit. He asked me if I was going to send him to prison. The absolute terror in his eyes confirmed that the structural collapse was complete. The illusion of his power was gone, leaving behind only a frightened thief sitting across from the man he had foolishly tried to destroy. I let the silence answer his desperate question for a long, agonizing moment. Justin had asked if I was going to send him to prison. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the father he knew to step forward and offer him a lifeline. He was waiting for the man who had always cleaned up his messes to tell him that everything was going to be fine. But that man no longer existed. "Am I going to send you to prison?" "Justin," I finally asked, letting my voice echo against the glass walls of the boardroom. "I am not sending you anywhere. You built your own prison with your own two hands. You forged the bars with stolen money and violent entitlement. I am simply deciding whether or not to lock the door behind you." Mr. Lawson reached into his briefcase one more time. He did not pull out another massive binder. He withdrew a single crisp sheet of paper. He slid it slowly across the polished oak table until it rested exactly where the forged medical document had been sitting just moments before. He placed the heavy silver pen directly on top of it. "This is a legally binding confession." I explained, my tone entirely conversational, but completely devoid of warmth. "It outlines your theft of $140,000 from my company. It acknowledges your deliberate submission of a forged medical document for the purposes of extortion. And most importantly, it contains a permanent, irrevocable renunciation of your position in my living trust." Justin stared at the single sheet of paper as if it were glowing hot. "By signing that document, I continued you legally sever your own bloodline from my estate. You surrender all future claims to my wealth, my properties, and my businesses. You will walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. You will never see a single dime of my money, and you will never attempt to contact me again." Justin pressed his trembling hands flat against his thighs. He looked over at Vanessa. She was staring at the confession with sheer, absolute horror. Signing that document meant she would officially be tethered to a bankrupt man with zero future prospects and a massive pile of hidden debt. The luxurious lifestyle she thought she had secured by marrying my son was evaporating right in front of her eyes. "You cannot do this," Vanessa whispered, her voice completely stripped of its former arrogance. "You are his father. You are supposed to protect him." I turned my gaze to her. "I was his father, Vanessa. But you both decided that my life was an annoying obstacle standing in the way of your luxury. You made a calculated gamble when you threw that crystal glass at my head. You played a very high-stakes game, and you lost." I turned back to my son. "You have exactly two options, Justin. Option one is simple. You pick up that silver pen and you sign your name. You walk out of this building completely broke and entirely on your own. You will have to face your creditors without my wallet to protect you, but you will walk out a free man. If you sign that confession, I will lock the forensic audit in my private vault, and the district attorney will never see it." I leaned slightly forward, resting my arms on the table, making sure he felt the absolute crushing gravity of the alternative. "Option two," I stated clearly. "You refuse to sign. If you do not put your ink on that paper within the next 60 seconds, Mr. Lawson will pick up that heavy black binder. He will walk out of this boardroom and he will drive directly to the district attorney. He will hand over the forensic audit proving your corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. He will hand over the forged medical diagnosis you just willingly submitted on the official legal record. And he will file a formal petition demanding the absolute maximum sentencing for Vanessa regarding her felony domestic assault charge." The boardroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents and the ragged, panicked breathing of my son. "If you choose option two, Justin, you will not just be poor. You will be a convicted felon. You will serve significant time in federal prison, and Vanessa will be sitting in a county cell right alongside you." Justin opened his mouth, trying desperately to find a third option. He tried to find a loophole or a way to manipulate my emotions. He tried to tell me that he was sorry. He tried to claim that the severe pressure of his failing marketing business had clouded his judgment. He actually attempted to squeeze a single tear from his eye, hoping the sight of his crying son would break my resolve and force me to show mercy. It did not work. A structural engineer does not feel pity for a collapsed beam that was built with cheap, corrupt materials. You simply clear away the debris and you move on. 50 seconds, I stated, looking down at my watch. The reality of the ticking clock finally broke through his delusion. Justin realized that I was not negotiating. I was delivering an absolute ultimatum. He looked at the silver pen resting on the table. He looked at the thick black binder that held his complete financial ruin. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap was inescapable. Beside him, Richard Vance suddenly began to shift frantically in his chair. The cheap, aggressive lawyer they had hired to intimidate me finally understood the catastrophic danger of his current position. He was sitting next to two clients who were actively being cornered into a federal fraud confession, and he had been the one to formally present the forged medical document to my attorney. He looked at the blinking red light of the recording device in the center of the table, and the color drained completely from his face. The cheap lawyer broke the heavy silence. Richard Vance cleared his throat, making a wet and nervous sound that echoed in the pristine boardroom. He slowly reached out a trembling hand and asked Mr. Lawson if he could briefly examine the first few pages of the forensic audit, as well as the independent medical affidavits I had mentioned. Mr. Lawson did not speak. He simply rotated the heavy black binder toward the lawyer and pushed the clear plastic folder containing the real medical evaluations across the polished oak table. Vance opened the binder. He was a man who made his living chasing ambulances and bullying insurance adjusters for quick cash settlements. He was entirely unequipped to handle a federal corporate fraud investigation. His eyes darted rapidly across the dense columns of financial data, the traced wire transfers, and the irrefutable proof of embezzlement. Then he opened the plastic folder and read the sworn affidavits from 3 separate board-certified physicians declaring my absolute mental competence. He looked back at the forged document he had personally submitted just 20 minutes prior. I watched the exact moment Richard Vance realized his entire career was standing on a trapdoor. If he continued to represent Justin and Vanessa, he would no longer be just a cheap attorney negotiating a family dispute. He would be an active co-conspirator in a documented federal extortion plot involving forged medical records and corporate wire fraud. He looked at the small, blinking red light of the recording device sitting in the center of the table. That light meant his voice was already captured permanently on the official record, presenting a fabricated document to steal a multi-million-dollar estate. Vance slammed the black binder shut. He shoved his chair back so violently that it squeaked loudly against the hardwood floor. He did not look at Justin. He did not look at Vanessa. He looked directly at the recording device. He stated his full legal name and his state bar license number, his voice shaking with pure panic. He declared for the official record that he was immediately withdrawing as legal counsel for Justin and Vanessa. He explicitly stated that he had been completely misled by his clients regarding the authenticity of the medical documents provided to him. Justin stared at him in absolute shock. He reached out and grabbed his lawyer's sleeve, begging him to sit down and demanding to know what he was doing. Vance yanked his arm away as if Justin were infected with a deadly disease. He frantically shoved his scattered papers into his scuffed vinyl briefcase, his hands fumbling with the cheap brass latches. He told my son that he was completely out of his mind. He told Justin that he would not lose his license to practice law and go to federal prison just to help a thief steal from his own father. Vanessa tried to stand up, her voice rising in a desperate, shrill plea. She reminded Vance that they had paid him a retainer. She demanded that he stay and do his job. Vance snapped his briefcase shut and looked at her with utter disgust. He told her she could expect a full refund of her miserable retainer mailed to whatever jail cell she ended up in. Without another word, Richard Vance turned on his heel and practically ran out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, sealing my son and his wife inside. The silence returned, but this time it was utterly suffocating for them. The grand illusion they had walked in with was entirely shattered. They had entered this pristine downtown office flanked by legal counsel armed with a forged weapon they believed would force my surrender. Now they were sitting completely alone across from me and the most ruthless estate attorney in the city. Their lawyer had abandoned them. Their leverage was exposed as a federal crime. They had absolutely no defense left. I looked down at my watch. I informed Justin that his 60 seconds were almost up. I reminded him that the moment the minute hand reached the top of the dial, Mr. Lawson would take the binder and walk out the door to the district attorney's office. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. The reality of his complete and total isolation was screaming loudly enough for the both of us. The heavy glass door swung shut behind Richard Vance, and the click of the latch echoed through the pristine boardroom like a gunshot. The 60 seconds I had given my son were rapidly draining away. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a peaceful room. It was the suffocating vacuum of a collapsed mine shaft. Justin stared at the empty chair where his lawyer had just been sitting. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. Vanessa stood completely frozen, with her oversized sunglasses clutched so tightly in her manicured hands that I thought the plastic frames would snap. Vanessa was the first to break. The sheer weight of the impending federal investigation crushed whatever was left of her carefully crafted facade. She turned slowly toward her husband. Her face was contorted with a mixture of absolute terror and unadulterated disgust. She did not lower her voice. She did not care that Mr. Lawson and I were sitting right across the table. She demanded to know what Justin was going to do. She practically screamed the words, letting them bounce shrilly against the glass walls. She told him that he had promised her the estate. She told him that he had sworn the old man was a pushover who would just roll over and hand them the keys to a luxurious life. Justin recoiled as if she had physically struck him. The illusion of his power was gone, and now the illusion of his perfect marriage was evaporating right in front of him. He pointed a shaking finger at her face. He yelled that he had everything completely under control until she lost her temper. He blamed her for everything. He told her that his embezzlement was entirely necessary to pay for the lavish lifestyle she demanded. He shouted that he had to steal from his own father's company just to buy her designer clothes and luxury vacations so she would not leave him for a richer man. He explicitly stated that her violent tantrum at Easter dinner the moment she threw that heavy crystal wine glass at my face was the sole reason the morality clause had been triggered. The boardroom dissolved into a theater of absolute misery. They were two parasites who had run out of a host and were now cannibalizing each other to survive. Vanessa stepped closer to him, with her voice dripping with pure venom. She told Justin that he was a pathetic failure. She admitted out loud that she never would have married a mid-level marketing manager with massive debt if she had not believed he was the sole heir to a multi-million-dollar fortune. She looked him dead in the eye and said he was completely useless to her without my bank accounts. The reality of the situation washed over Vanessa like a bucket of ice water. She realized out loud that because he was cornered into signing a confession of corporate fraud, he would have absolutely no money to hire a defense attorney for her criminal trial. She was going to face a judge for felony domestic assault, and her husband was entirely bankrupt. She screamed that he was supposed to protect her from the police. She screamed that he had ruined her life. Justin stood up and his face became a mottled mask of rage and humiliation. He leaned over the polished oak table and screamed that she was going to jail. He told her he would never spend another dime on her even if he had the money. He declared that their marriage was over right there in the middle of a corporate law office. He blamed her greedy parents for pushing him to accelerate the timeline. He blamed her entitlement for draining his stolen funds. He blamed everyone but the man staring back at him in the mirror. Vanessa fired back, calling him a coward who had to forge medical documents because he was too weak to earn a legitimate living. They were hurling their ugliest truths at each other, dismantling their entire relationship piece by piece. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded on the table. Mr. Lawson sat beside me, maintaining an expression of professional indifference. We did not interrupt them. We did not ask them to lower their voices. I watched the destruction of their alliance with the clinical detachment of a structural engineer viewing a demolition. I had removed the load-bearing pillar of my wealth, and the entire house of cards they had built together was violently crashing down. The love they claimed to have for each other was exposed as nothing more than a mutual transaction. It was a business arrangement founded on my stolen money, and the funds had just officially dried up. Vanessa began to cry, the ugly, desperate tears of someone who realizes they have trapped themselves in a burning building. She turned to me and tried to plead. She begged me to understand that she was just following Justin's lead. She tried to say that Justin had forced her to act hostile toward me so they could build a case for my mental decline. Justin shouted that she was a liar and a manipulator. He told me not to listen to a word she said. They were fighting for scraps of mercy from a man they had just tried to lock in a psychiatric facility. I looked down at my watch. The gold second hand was sweeping toward the 12. The 60 seconds I had granted him were over. I cleared my throat. The sound was soft, but it immediately cut through their screaming match. Justin and Vanessa snapped their heads toward me. Their faces were flushed, and their chests were heaving. They looked at me as if they had briefly forgotten I was sitting right across from them, holding the detonator to their lives. I looked directly at my son. I tapped my index finger against the polished oak table right next to the crisp white confession document and the heavy silver pen. I told Justin that his time was up. I told him he needed to make a choice immediately because Mr. Lawson was reaching for the black binder. The screaming stopped. The panic was absolute. The room fell entirely silent once again, leaving my son staring at the pen that would end his life of privilege forever. Mr. Lawson slowly extended his right hand across the polished oak table. His fingers brushed against the heavy leather cover of the black binder. It was a subtle movement, but to Justin it must have looked like the swing of an executioner's axe. My son let out a sharp, trembling breath that sounded almost like a sob. The sheer terror of federal prison finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. He saw the cold, sterile reality of a concrete cell closing in around him. Justin reached out with a violently shaking hand. His fingers hovered over the heavy silver pen. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, perhaps hoping that I would suddenly intervene and stop him. He looked up at my face, searching for the loving father who used to bandage his scraped knees and pay his speeding tickets. I offered him absolutely nothing. My expression remained entirely, completely blank. I was a vault that had been permanently sealed. Justin picked up the pen. He leaned heavily over the crisp white document. His breathing was ragged and uneven as he brought the ink down to the paper. I watched him sign his full legal name at the bottom of the confession. I watched him scratch his initials next to the specific clauses outlining his theft of $140,000. I watched him initial the paragraph explicitly acknowledging his knowing submission of a forged medical diagnosis. Then he reached the final section of the document, the irrevocable renunciation of his inheritance. He hesitated again. Tears began to spill from his eyes, dripping down his pale cheeks and staining the collar of his expensive navy suit. He was signing away a multi-million-dollar empire. He was officially severing his own bloodline from the wealth that Beatrice and I had spent 4 decades building. He was bankrupting himself with a single stroke of a pen. He closed his eyes tightly and dragged the silver tip across the dotted line. The deed was done. Justin dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the wooden table and rolled away. He slumped back into his leather chair, looking entirely hollowed out. He had walked into this downtown office believing he was a king arriving to claim his throne. He was now a destitute, confessed criminal who had just surrendered his entire future merely to avoid a federal indictment. Mr. Lawson smoothly pulled the signed document across the table. He inspected the signatures and the initials with absolute professional precision. He placed the confession securely into a clean plastic folder and closed his briefcase. Vanessa had been watching the entire process in a state of paralyzed horror. She stared at the signed paper disappearing into the briefcase. She looked at her husband, who was now weeping quietly into his hands. Then she looked at me. A new, terrifying realization suddenly dawned on her. She leaned forward and asked about her criminal charges. She reminded me that the initial offer brought by her cheap lawyer was that I would drop the domestic assault charges in exchange for a peaceful resolution. She begged me to call the district attorney right now and tell them the entire incident was a misunderstanding. She pleaded with me to save her from a felony conviction. I looked at Vanessa and allowed a very small, very cold smile to touch my lips. I explained to her that she had severely misunderstood the nature of our transaction. I told Vanessa that Justin signed that document to save himself from federal corporate fraud charges and extortion. His signature ensured that Mr. Lawson would not drive to the district attorney's office today with the heavy black binder and the forged medical record. I clarified that the confession had absolutely nothing to do with her violent attack on me. I reminded her that my blood was still deeply stained into my dining room rug. Vanessa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She realized the trap had not just closed on Justin, it had closed on her as well. I explicitly informed her that I would be fully cooperating with the prosecution regarding her felony domestic assault case. I told her I would testify in court. I told her I would present the emergency room photographs of my split forehead to a jury. The absolute devastation hit her with the force of a freight train. She was going to face a criminal trial for a violent felony. She was facing potential jail time and a permanent criminal record. And the man sitting next to her, her husband, had just officially signed away every single dime to his name. Justin could not afford to buy her a cup of coffee, let alone hire a competent criminal defense attorney to keep her out of a county cell. She was entirely doomed. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and buttoned my charcoal suit jacket. I looked down at the two miserable people sitting across the polished table. They were thoroughly broken. I told them that this meeting was officially concluded. I told them that they had 5 minutes to vacate my attorney's office before security would be called to forcibly escort them to the street. I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on my son and his wife, and I walked out of the boardroom. 6 months have passed since the heavy glass doors of the downtown law office swung shut. The bitter winter thawed into a bright and unforgiving spring. I have not spoken a single word to my son since that morning. I did not need to. The legal system and the crushing weight of their own financial ruin communicated everything that needed to be said. My private investigator sent me one final concluding report to close the file permanently. I read it while sitting on my quiet patio drinking my morning coffee. The details of their new reality were stark and completely devoid of the luxury they once demanded. Vanessa stood before a county judge in late February. Without access to my wealth, Justin could only afford a severely overworked public defender to represent her. The judge looked at the high-resolution emergency room photographs of my lacerated forehead and listened to her recorded confession from the boardroom. She did not serve years in a state penitentiary, but she was convicted of a violent felony. She received a harsh probationary sentence, hundreds of hours of manual community service, and a permanent criminal record. That record instantly destroyed any chance she had of securing comfortable corporate employment. The woman who used to demand a free wing in my multi-million-dollar estate now spends her days wearing a stained polyester uniform. She works the early morning shift at a fast food drive-thru on the edge of town. Her hands, which used to display expensive manicures paid for with my stolen money, are now blistered from hot grease and harsh cleaning chemicals. She spends 8 hours a day on her feet, handing paper bags to customers she used to openly despise. The wealthy friends she used to impress have completely blocked her phone number. Every time the state deducts mandatory legal restitution fees from her minimum wage paycheck, she is reminded of the crystal wine glass she threw at my face. Her arrogant pride has been entirely replaced by the exhausting reality of chronic poverty. Justin was spared a federal indictment only because I locked the forensic audit in my vault as promised. But avoiding prison did not save him from absolute ruin. When his marketing firm inevitably collapsed under his gross mismanagement and the sudden withdrawal of my stolen funds, his creditors circled him like starving wolves. He was forced to liquidate his expensive cars, his designer watches, and every single piece of luxury furniture he owned, just to keep himself out of debtor's prison. He was evicted from his high-rise apartment, and his credit score was reduced to ashes. My son now resides in a damp, cramped studio apartment on the industrial side of the city. The space is barely large enough for a single bed and a rusted kitchen sink. The constant roar of highway traffic shakes the thin windows day and night. But Justin does not live in this miserable box alone. Because Gary and Patricia lost their condominium to the foreclosure debt I purchased, they were left completely destitute. The parasitic in-laws had absolutely no other options and nowhere else to go. They moved their remaining cheap suitcases directly into the tiny studio with the man they now openly despise. The daily existence inside that cramped room is a suffocating nightmare. The investigator noted that neighbors frequently call the local police to report loud screaming matches coming through the thin drywall. Patricia blames Justin every single day for failing to secure the inheritance and forcing her to live in squalor. Gary loudly resents my son for being a broke failure sitting in his undershirt and complaining about the cheap canned food they are forced to eat. Justin screams back at them, blaming their entitled daughter for ruining his entire life with her violent temper. Justin sleeps on a thin, dirty mattress on the floor, while his miserable in-laws take up the only small bed in the room. They are trapped together, breathing the same stale air, suffocating under the massive weight of their collective debt. They have absolutely no one to blame but themselves, and they are forced to look at each other every single morning and remember exactly what they threw away. They built their lives around the assumption that I would always be there to absorb the impact of their terrible decisions. They truly believed they could treat me like disposable garbage and still feast on the fruits of my lifelong labor. Now they are discovering how cold the world truly is when the furnace is permanently turned off. I closed the final investigative report and walked inside to my home office. I dropped the thick stack of papers into the heavy-duty shredder. I stood perfectly still and watched the sharp steel blades slice the words into thousands of tiny, unreadable ribbons. The mechanical hum of the machine was incredibly peaceful. My son and his wife were no longer my problem. They were simply a closed chapter in a book I was completely finished reading. 2 weeks after shredding the final investigative report, I walked out to the edge of my manicured front lawn. A real estate agent followed closely behind me, carrying a wooden post and a large metal sign. I instructed him to plant it firmly into the soft green earth. The estate was officially on the market. I did not need a sprawling 4-bedroom fortress built for a family that no longer existed. The massive home with its vaulted ceilings and custom mahogany dining room had become nothing more than a giant, empty shell. It took exactly 4 days to find a buyer. A young couple with a newborn baby made a cash offer. They walked through the bright hallways with genuine joy in their eyes. They did not look at the crown molding with greedy calculation. They just wanted a safe place to raise their child. I signed the closing papers with a profound sense of relief. The estate liquidators came a week later. I instructed them to sell the antique furniture, the crystal vases, and the expensive rugs. I kept absolutely nothing but a small box of photographs of Beatrice and a few essential items of clothing. For 40 years, I had accumulated heavy, expensive things because I thought I was building a legacy for my son. I thought I was building a foundation that would last for generations. I realized that true freedom meant carrying as little weight as possible. I packed a single soft leather suitcase. I left the heavy keys on the empty kitchen counter, and I walked out the front door for the very last time. I did not look back at the grand facade. The structure was sound, but it was no longer my home. The drive to the international airport was incredibly smooth. I hired a private car service so I could simply sit in the back seat and watch the city roll away from me. The afternoon sun was warm and golden. I watched the suburban neighborhoods fade into tall glass buildings and eventually into the wide open stretch of the highway. For decades, my entire existence had been tied to the local geography of my engineering firm and my ungrateful family. I had paid for vacations to tropical resorts for Justin and his wife while I stayed behind to monitor the business accounts. Beatrice and I had always talked about visiting Europe. We had a map in our study where we placed small pins on the cities we wanted to see. Paris and Rome and Vienna. We always told each other we would go when Justin was finally settled and secure. We waited for a day that simply never came. I arrived at the terminal and checked my single leather bag. The attendant handed me a thick, premium boarding pass. I walked through the security gates and entered the private first-class lounge. The atmosphere was incredibly quiet and refined. There was no screaming. There were no demands. There were no entitled relatives asking me to open my wallet. I sat in a plush armchair overlooking the massive glass windows of the tarmac. I ordered a hot cup of black coffee and drank it slowly. I watched the massive airplanes landing and taking off, carrying people to every corner of the world. The world felt incredibly vast and full of endless possibilities. I was 69 years old, but I felt a lightness in my chest that I had not experienced since I was a very young man. The boarding announcement echoed softly through the quiet lounge. I picked up my jacket and walked toward my designated gate. The flight attendants greeted me warmly and guided me to my seat in the first-class cabin. It was a wide, comfortable space isolated from the noise and chaos of the main cabin. I sat down and fastened my seatbelt. A flight attendant offered me a glass of champagne to celebrate the journey. I accepted the glass and held the cool crystal in my hand. It was a beautiful, delicate glass that looked absolutely nothing like the heavy weapon Vanessa had thrown at me on Easter Sunday. I took a slow sip. The champagne was crisp and perfect. The heavy engines roared to life, and the massive airplane began to taxi down the long, concrete runway. I looked out the small oval window as the ground moved faster and faster beneath us. The plane lifted smoothly into the bright blue sky, leaving the city and all its bitter memories far below. As we climbed higher above the clouds, I reached up with my free hand. I gently traced the tips of my fingers along the skin just above my left eyebrow. The deep cut had fully healed over the last 6 months. It left behind a thin, pale line that was barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. I ran my fingers over the faint scar tissue. It did not hurt. It did not feel like a mark of violent betrayal or a painful reminder of a broken family. It felt like the key that had finally unlocked my prison door. If Vanessa had never thrown that glass, I might have spent the rest of my natural life suffocating under their endless demands. I might have died in that massive empty house believing it was my duty to fund their arrogant mistakes. The scar was the exact price of my absolute liberation, and it was the best investment I had ever made. I lowered my hand and rested it on the wide armrest. I took another sip of champagne and watched the brilliant white clouds spreading out endlessly toward the horizon. My phone was turned off and securely packed away in my bag. No one knew exactly where I was going, and no one had the power to demand my return. I was completely unburdened. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the soft seat, ready to begin the final and most peaceful chapter of my life. The greatest lesson I learned is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional tolerance for abuse. We are often taught that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred obligation that requires us to sacrifice our own peace for the sake of our children. But when blood relatives view your existence merely as a financial resource, that bond becomes a heavy chain. True family is not defined by shared DNA, but by mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and unselfish love. Cutting ties with toxic people, even your own flesh and blood, is not a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and the only true path to freedom. If you have ever had to make the difficult decision to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace, please share your story in the comments below.